Vanessa.
Hi, Tom. Bonjour. Bonsoir.
For a change, Vanessa and I are on the same level of tired, but for good reasons, because we are in Paris, and although we are technically on holiday, we are not really feeling it yet, because we are dutifully here to deliver you an episode of Uncertain Things.
I mean, speak for yourself. I've been in a holiday vibes until you came into the hotel lobby frenzied saying, we haven't released an Uncertain Things episode. And I was like, c'est vrai.
I brought anxiety with me from New York.
Yes. I put down my beret and my café au lait. No, I'm kidding. I'm just saying stupid French things because it makes me happy.
She's savoring the moment.
Yes.
But yes, we have just landed or disembarked in Paris, and realizing that we have not yet released this episode, we are here recording this intro as professionally as possible on my phone. But there's not much to set up because everything will be introduced in the interview itself. This is a return visit by fan favorite Peter Turchin.
Yes, Peter Turchin, who you may remember is the project leader at the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna, and also a research associate at the University of Oxford, where we just were, actually, Adam. We just got on the train from Oxford to London to Paris. And he has a new book out, which is why he graced us with his presence so soon after his previous appearance. And that book, which everyone should get because it's really, really good read, is End Times, Elites, Counter-Elites, and the Path of Political Disintegration.
So we'll just recommend that if you haven't already, do listen to our first interview with Mr. Turchin, because it sets up much of what we're talking about here. And by the end of it, we realize we'll need to have him on again. So this is session 2. We might have a session 3 yet. So
there's more collapse to come.
There's more collapse to come. Yes. To remind you, he's the creator of Cryodynamics, the attempt to use social sciences in ways to extrapolate the future and make predictions more like the quote unquote real sciences. And we talk about the methodology in the first episode, and here we discuss his prediction that we are at the precipice of societal collapse, and we discuss this, what could be done, how bad things really are, and whether he's more Harry Seldon or Leto II, Emperor of Dune. So stick along, let us know what you think, and
share us with your ami and your enemy.
That was a breach too far for me. And let us know if you prefer us to always have the intros on voice memos, because clearly that's where our talents really shine. We hope you enjoy Peter Turchin.
Enjoy. Thank you so much, Peter, for agreeing to come back. Only a few months after we talked to you last time. We had such a good time last time. So grateful that you agreed to come back now that the book is out. Congrats.
It's my pleasure, and thank you.
Is the book officially out?
Yes, it's out as of the day before yesterday.
Excellent. So to briefly recap our last conversation, when we talked last time, we kind of got very nerdy into the methodology, all the ways that you were trying to collect the data, catalog the data, and essentially quantify something, subject matter history, which a lot of historians have found to be unquantifiable in the past. And all of this allowed you to generate the predictions that you did. And then we also spent a fair amount of time talking about the drivers of social unrest, and especially elite overproduction. We kind of dug deep into that subject matter. So we were hoping for this conversation to kind of dwell a bit more, now that we have those, fundamentals kind of set from the previous conversation. For this one, we're hoping to diagnose the present moment and understand the potential pathways of the future that we could be headed down, if that sounds okay with you.
Sounds good.
Great. So let's start with where we are today. When you think about where our society is at, what are the potential pathways that you see us heading towards? What are the scenarios that could be in our future?
We should also say that us is being very American-centric at this.
Sure.
At least at this starting point, we are going to expand, but especially in the United States. Where are we in this crumbling empire of ours?
Okay, let's step back first and do a very quick recap of what we talked about last time.
Previously on.
Right. So complex human societies, which have been around about 5,000 years, they can experience periods of internal peace and stability for a while, maybe a century or so. But then inevitably, at least in the past, they get into end times, periods of heightened social unrest and political disintegration. So the big question that my book tries to answer is why. Examples, by the way, include things like French and Russian Revolution, American Civil War, and we can talk about other examples. We can go beyond the Western world. So why is, as we talked about, a common theme in pre-crisis times is elite overproduction. And what is elite overproduction? First of all, the elites are simply the small proportion of the population who concentrate social power in their hands. So this is the proverbial 1% in America, the Mandarin class in imperial China, military nobility in medieval France, if you go further back into the past. So the key question is, how are elites reproduced and recruited? And here we make a note that there are always more elite wannabes, elite aspirants, than power positions. And some competition is good and healthy, but excessive competition, when there are 3, 4, 5 times as many, that leads to serious problems. So in the book, I illustrate this with a game similar to musical chairs, but except instead of taking chairs away in each round, you keep adding players. So at first you have 15 players for 10 chairs and 20, 30, 40. You can imagine the chaos that is going to ensue, especially as some players will want to break the rules because they can see they're not getting ahead in this game.
Right. You mentioned in the book that the epidemic of cheating is kind of an extension of the competitive nature of too many folks trying to get into too few prestigious positions.
Exactly. So this is where the game theory fails, because in the game theory, players, they cannot break rules. But in real life, humans break rules all the time. And so I think we discussed how we got to this situation in the United States, which became very clear by 2016, when there were 17 major candidates in the presidential primaries on the Republican side. And one of them started breaking rules and did it very effectively. Others tried to emulate Trump, but it didn't help them as much. And then eventually Trump won. And so since then, this rule breaking has been happening on both sides. And so today, for example, we have just heard that former President Trump has been arrested essentially for well, it doesn't matter what the crimes are, but the point is that both parties are now using lawfare against each other. So it's very likely that there would be some kind of legal movements against President Joe Biden also. So I think this is actually the first time in history, American history, when we will see both candidates who have the best shot being essentially under very serious legal proceedings.
I do want to pause on this point because it is topical with the arraignment of Trump and the very likely reality of Republican House starting proceedings against Biden at some point. You see that as a form of cheating, or is the fact that the initial rise of a character like Trump, who shows nothing but disdain to the system as a whole, in fact, was elevated to that position for his disdain for the system as a whole, and in that sense embodies the taste for cheating because the system is failed and corrupt. Do you see that as the symptom of our decline, the crumbling of legitimacy, or in itself as kind of elite overproduction, because competition for those sought out power positions is so tight that everybody understands that the only way to get ahead is to push against the constraining rules of the system and cheat?
Well, first of all, cheating maybe is a strong word. So let's say breaking rules, and you can break rules to a different degree. That's one point. Second point is that, as you know, and I make this point very strong in the book, I take a completely non-partisan approach. So I criticize equally the Republicans and the Democrats. And so I see that both sides of the aisle, so to speak, the methods that they are using are becoming more and more extreme on both sides.
And they're exogenous to the system. They're not playing within the traditional rules of the democratic process as established in the United States for the past 200 years.
Exactly. They're getting outside of the rules on both from both sides, and that's what I see is the breaking down of the social norms that govern our, democratic governance, essentially.
So our next step is understanding where we are today as Americans, as in the American system, right? Where do you see this shift starting? Where do you see this crumbling starting to occur to the point where we now have two parties, the two institutions, if you can call them that traditionally hold the seats of power, playing outside of the context and the rules that have brought them to that position, and in fact working actively to undermine the system as it is?
Yes, I see this is starting to happen during the 2010s and become obvious in 2016. Remember that neither Republican Party nor Democratic Party are monolithic at this point, or have been for the last 6-7 years. Republicans are divided between pro-Trumpian and more traditional Republican factions. But in the democratic country, we have more left-leaning members, such as Bernie Sanders, and more traditional Democrats. And I argue in the book that at this point, the mainstream Democratic Party has abandoned its roots as a worker party, which it was during the New Deal, and it is now the party of the ruling class. And left-wing populists like Sanders are not really terribly acceptable to the ruling class, no more than right-wing populists such as Trump. And so, as you know, during 2016 elections, there were certain moves taken by the party establishment that some argue actually prevented Bernie Sanders from getting the nomination. So the point I'm making is that by 2016, the elite of our production has reached the point where we see not only the breaking the rules between the two major parties, but also the parties fragmenting. It's sort of like 1850s. Think about the road to the American Civil War. During the 1850s, the two-party system broke down completely. At some point, you had, a dozen of parties, know-nothings, and of course, Republicans were one of those new parties. So this fragmentation of the political landscape we see now, where within each of the parties there is as much animosity as between parties. That is one of the signs that...
Right, and you can see that also to listeners who might not be as plugged in or care that much about politics. You can see that even right now, as just a few weeks ago, Kevin McCarthy was trying to pass his debt ceiling deal, which was, arguably necessary to prevent fiscal collapse for the United States. He barely eked it out, not because of the Democrats, but because his own party was constantly trying to set up tripwires for him.
Exactly. So, as I said, there is a very strong faction now within the Republican Party that is anti-establishment.
Mm-hmm. These are all basically signs for you, signs of potential further fragmentation, potentially leading to, civil war or something else like it. So I think what I would love to do is explore with you later the ways we can avert kind of societal collapse and war. But before we get there, I do want to understand, what do you think's at stake? Because it sounds, I think from reading your book, you say we are at a state of pre-crisis. What could crisis look like?
Well, in fact, now we are clearly in crisis. I think it has become very clear that the summer of riots during the 2020 and especially the storming of the Capitol in January of 2021, those are clear signs that the crisis have begun. All right, so now we still have options, and we can talk about that because there still is a possibility of both relatively benign way of living the crisis, and also, unfortunately, there is a very real possibility of things like civil war or some kind of a fragmentation of the United States into two or more pieces. None of those dire outcomes has a huge probability, but those probabilities are not zero.
Before we even go to the extremes, at the edges of the bell curve, we have the option instead of total collapse, fragmentation. This is the David French worst case scenario. But on the other side, you say that there is maybe a way out, an easier landing, and we will talk about what's required for that in a second. That's our golden path. But you said those are the least likely options to get both of them. So what's in the center of the bell curve? Where are we likely to be going if it's not total collapse or an easy landing?
Okay, so when we talked last, we have gathered 100 cases in our crisis DB, and we've been busy. So now we are approaching 200 cases. We can do statistics. We can see what happened. How did past societies exit those crises? And there we see a distribution. Indeed, the outright collapse is not very common. It's maybe 20% of cases when you have, what do I mean by collapse? It's, first of all, very drastic decrease in the population, right? In some of our cases, the societies lose more than half of their members. It's long, lingering civil war, in some cases lasting more than 100 years. So essentially, you have the completely fragmented, politically fragmented landscape, and there is no new state arising from that landscape. And also think about that the elites are the most vulnerable during those periods.
And that's when the elites' heads end up on pikes.
Yeah, exactly. Their heads end up, guillotined or
there's many imaginative ways to take care of their heads.
So what we've done is scored the outcomes by on a scale of variables from 0 to 13, just counting how many of the direct consequences are. In most cases, I actually have half of those consequences, right? So the most common outcome is a huge outpouring of human misery. It's only in 10 or 15 cases. Yes, I'm sorry to say that, but that's what the data say, all right?
It's not collapse. It's just, and that's the term that the scientific term that you've dubbed it. It's a huge outpouring of human misery.
Yes, and we can, yes. So, but the hope is that in 10-15% of cases, there is really no bloodshed. The elites pull together and cooperate with population. So this is what happened, let's say, during the progressive and New Deal eras in the United States, during the Chartist period, which is middle of the 19th century in the British Empire. British Empire was the only large European state that escaped revolutions of 1848, all right? So they did something right. We can take hope by looking at those positive examples. But keep in mind that they're pretty rare. That's the problem.
Yeah, I want to hear a little bit about the 1848 escape in Britain, because my assumption is that they were, in a sense, ahead of the curve because of they had an early embrace of a nation-state model, and in a way they've anticipated a lot of the revolutionary forces in a way that was already pre-incorporated into their ruling class, right? The revolutionary urges in 19th century Britain were already different. Plus, some of the more revolutionary forces ended up extricating and migrating to the United States.
We can talk about that because my story is somewhat different. And I'm happy to talk about it in more detail.
I would love to hear that. So let's create a small bubble for that. I want to hear your story, and then I want to ask you about an outpouring of huge human misery.
Yeah, I want to understand what the misery is, and then after that, let's definitely go into examples of extrication, because I do want to make sure we spend time on that.
Okay.
So just to tell me about Britain first.
Okay, so Britain did not escape lightly because of the Industrial Revolution. For the first century of Industrial Revolution, roughly speaking from 1750 to 1850, as the economy was growing quite rapidly at unprecedented before that time rates, the conditions of working people were steadily getting worse. Their real wages stagnated and even declined, their heights declined, and there was a huge feeling that we are being left behind.
The Dickensian aspect of it all.
Yeah, exactly. Dickens was precisely writing at that time. So that took outlet in a variety of worker disturbances. The worst one was the so-called Peterloo Massacre, which happened in Manchester, when several dozen of people were killed because the British cavalry rode into a crowd of workers and started killing them with sabers. But it was not the only isolated occurrence. And so this shocked some segments of the elites, and also many of the elites coming from the working class. And there was the Chartist movement that proposed a charter that would essentially rebalance the social system in UK. Now, UK was a little bit lucky because they had an empire. And as you remember, the two driving forces of this crisis are popular immiseration, and you can relieve it by essentially emigrating, sometimes forcefully emigrating, part of the working classes away from England. That way you diminish the supply of labor and allow the wages to go up. And that's what happened. But secondly, there was a huge problem with elite reproduction, too many, again, elite wannabes, and they also were shipped to positions in the British Empire. That helped to flatten the curve, so to speak. That gave time for the elites to finally work out.
Release some of the pressure.
It did not remove the problem, because the wealth pump, right? The wealth pump is essentially this perverse mechanism that pumps wealth from workers to the elites. So if you remember that, as I said, for a century before 1850 or so, the economy grew, but workers' wages did not grow. And all that extra wealth went where? Of course, it went to the economic elites. So they managed to reverse this problem by stopping the wealth pump. How? First of all, they increased suffrage. They gave the right to vote to the male population. So that increased the democratic institutions quite well, gave workers more power so they could bargain with employers. They abolished the corn laws. So most people on the American side would not know what the corn laws were. The corn laws did not allow any importation of grain, and therefore it allowed the producers of grain within Britain to artificially increase the price. So this is one of the forms the wealth pump takes by selling very dear grain and bread and flour and so on to the workers. The elites were pumping wealth out of them. So abolishing the corn laws allowed importation of cheap and plentiful American wheat into England, and that really increased the well-being of people because food became much cheaper. So
I want to just use this to make as we do, brackets within a bracket. Basically, what they did, they erased some tariffs that were good for local elite producers and bad for the population overall.
Yes.
Ironically, you use this to some of our listeners who view Trump as supporter of the working class. This is the classic mistake of somebody like Trump presenting himself as a populist by imposing tariffs that end up only serving, as tariffs do, the chief producers of a specific industry, while at the same time creating pressures that inflate the costs of goods.
Well, certainly that was the case with mid-19th century Britain, because bread, of course, was the main staple for the working class. Also, they imposed really punishing taxes on the wealthy and landowners. You may remember that by the beginning of the 20th century, this sad novels about how the manors, lords of manors, have to sell them because they cannot pay taxes and things like that. Of course, this was a bad thing for them, but it actually rebalanced the social system. It made it much less top-heavy. So a variety, and by the way, it took them like several decades to adopt this. It only was by 1880s when we see the worker well-being turn around, the wages started growing together with the economy.
And by that time, you also have the Fabian movement that creates much more groundswell support for some kind of democratic social reform in England. Okay, so that was actually, I think, really helpful also just to think of the different parameters that go into this question of social pressure and how the wealth bump expresses itself and how it can be allayed.
Right, and how to avert catastrophe knowingly or unknowingly by a series of reforms.
Okay, next question, Vanessa.
Well, shall we get back to the misery?
Yeah. Huge outpouring of misery.
Huge outpouring of human misery.
Our most likely scenario. Tell us about it.
What does that look like?
Yes.
Yeah, what does it mean?
Well, let's take one rather extreme example that I discuss at some length in my book, which is the Taiping Rebellion in China during the 1860s. So, of course, this was the bloodiest civil war known to humanity. Probably 50 million people got killed, certainly more than 30 million. All right, so that's, I think that qualifies as as huge amount of human misery when you have tens of millions of people dead. And if you
but isn't that the 20%? You said 20% was civil war and outright collapse versus the vast majority is just misery. So are you saying, obviously civil war is miserable, but is there a difference between kind of
20% collapse
violence?
means that there is, it's like most population is gone, buildings are crumbling. Think about collapse of the Roman Empire, for example, or collapse of the Maya civilization in Tikal and other cities. So that's the extreme. But such extreme collapses seem to be happening less frequently as we get closer to the present. As human societies have accumulated governance institutions, including democracy, for example, but also things like capitalism, which makes economies more productive. So that seems to have a positive effect on, first of all, the severity of collapses become much less severe. And secondly, the periods after collapse are shorter, this interregna, when you have civil wars and things like that. But let's still keep in mind that what's important for us, that we've been in a crisis for only 3 years, but typically such crises in the past last between 10 and 20 years, and some of them even longer. So it seems like all 2020s are going to be quite turbulent. And the second reason why I think it's turbulent is because none of the structural drivers for crisis, for instability have been addressed yet. Remember, so how would we know that the wealth pump stopped is when the wages of workers will start growing together with GDP per capita, right? This has not happened. In fact, ironically, under Trump, real wages increased a little bit, but under Biden, they decreased primarily because of very stiff inflation that we've had over the past 2 or 3 years. So this has not changed there has been no steps taken by the government, let's say, of Joe Biden, who actually semi-promised to increase the minimum wage, but they have not done it. So, in fact, because of inflation, the real minimum wage continues to decline.
One of the drivers that you're outlining here is the wages haven't been addressed. What are other red flags that you're seeing that haven't yet been addressed? Okay, we still continue to overproduce the youth with advanced degrees. The most dangerous degree is the law degree. If you think about it, Lenin was a lawyer, Castro, Robespierre, also Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer, and Gandhi was a lawyer. So many of these leaders of the counter elites who led successful, and many of them who led unsuccessful, which I didn't mention, movements, they were lawyers. In the United States, if you want to get into the political office, there are two major pipes leading to that. One of them is you either inherit wealth or you are a self-made wealthy person, and then you can try to convert that into political office. So think about, again, Donald Trump, but also Michael Bloomberg, or an unsuccessful example would be Steve Forbes. So people of that kind. But the second pipe is essentially getting the law degree. If you don't have wealth and you want to become the president or even just a senator, then you go to the law school and get law degree. Well, we have been already overproducing lawyers at the rate of 3 times as many as there are positions for lawyers. And as a result of this, I talk about this in the book, we have what's known as a bimodal distribution of new lawyer salaries. So people who come out from law school, maybe a quarter of them get really good salaries, now approaching $200,000 per year. Those are clearly on the way into the elites. But the large chunk of the population, more than half, get around 60,000 a year salaries. And considering that many of them, a couple 100,000 debts that they have to pay off, essentially they are losing ground, and they are the ones who are going to be what we call in the theory frustrated elites, and some of them will turn into counter elites who will challenge the existing order. Now, this situation is going to get only worse. Of course, we all have read about ChatGPT-4. Well, there is, according to some estimates, ChatGPT-4 already, the existing version, can eliminate 45% of what lawyers do. So if you have now this game of musical chairs where you have 3 times as many players as chairs, after ChatGPT runs amok, you'll have 6 times as many players as chairs. And you can imagine that it's not going to make the situation better. So both on the elite overproduction side and on the population side, there is, I don't see yet any signs of trend reversals that would give me optimism to see how we can come out of this. In America, we have examples of ways we have extricated ourselves from the path of collapse before. I do want to talk about I think you call it the era of good feelings too, this kind of New Deal into post-World War II era. But I want you to talk about it from the perspective of culture as well, because one of the things that stood out to us from the book was that, it takes a culture of self-reform, which means it takes a culture of values, elites holding values that come before their own self-interest. And that was really interesting to us. So would you mind telling us a little bit about that history with that lens of the cultural values that were in place that allowed the reforms to happen?
Sure. It's not even culture. It's almost social psychology. So let's think about why do wealth pumps...
What is culture if not social psychology?
Culture is actually information that is socially transmitted. Obviously, those are related concepts, but I tend to think about culture as a more long-term thing. So, for example, in the United States, we have inherited much of the cultural genome of the British Empire. So that's why we have a particular kind of democracy. All right. So that is, in the book, I talk about, for example, Egypt, which has been governed by military elites over the past.
I was going to bring this example, actually.
Yes.
You bring up how different cultures replicate their source of legitimacy. And so I actually, before you explore this, I want to set this up because this is what I was thinking of culture. And I guess we'll get to the distinction between social psychology in a moment. You take the examples of several countries and show how they derive their legitimacy from a specific source, and the replication of culture makes them rediscover that source over time. So even as revolutionary movements come and go in those countries, the source of legitimacy obtains, which to me is fascinating because I in my ongoing debates with friend of the pod, Batya Rogan Sargon, and with friend of the pod, Misha Thomas, the one takes psychology, the other takes economic principles as the guides of social behavior. I, in contrast, take culture. I see culture as the big driver. And I think I'm almost the anti-Marxist in the sense if Marxism sees culture as the reflection of elite interests in an unconscious attempt to replicate them and freeze them, I see culture as the thing that constrains and defines and guides the morals and behaviors of elites. So the examples that you bring up, for instance, Egypt as being militocracy, and China as being, I guess, a bureaucracy,
Yes.
a system, a government set up around the administrative state, where the bureaucratic elite holds power. Both of them have, over time, with Egypt, you go all the way back to the Mamluks, and with China, obviously, to the Mandarin, all the way back to the Han Dynasty and the Confucian culture of administrative education. In all of them, you see that in the turmoils of the centuries, they have still maintained the same center of power, or the center from which power derives its legitimacy. And that's what I see as culture.
Yes, they reconstitute themselves using what worked very well previously, essentially. So let's step back for a second. Remember, we talked about elites are the small proportion of the population who concentrate social power in their hands. Social power comes in four flavors. First of all, it's coercion, military power. Secondly, it's economic power. Third, it's administrative or political. And fourth is ideological. So it happens.
Sorry, I missed the second one. First was coercive. Second was which?
Economic.
Economic.
Yes. Then you have political administrative, which is one kind. And finally, ideological. So in Egypt, the governing elites have concentrated on the military power. And we can see this in the last century, that Egypt has been ruled by one general after another. And after the Egyptian revolution, a new kind of government came into power. This was Muslim Brotherhood. All right. So, which, by the way, this is an ideological basis of power because it's a religious-based power. But then generals reasserted themselves very rapidly by overthrowing Morsi, who was the president, and installing al-Sisi, who is, again, a general in power. So we can see that even after very serious perturbation, the previous system reasserted itself. Same thing in China. In China, more than 2,000 years of being governed by a class of scholar magistrates. And so after the 1 century of humiliation, when China was really fragmented and was torn apart by outside powers, when it has reasserted itself, it has by now converged back to the same mode of operations. And in fact, we can call the present government the Red Dynasty. So the Red Dynasty has now become the successor of the Qing dynasty. And they have acknowledged it because each successful dynasty, the first thing they do after they solidify their power, they
establish civil exams.
No, well, that's one thing. But second thing, they appoint a bunch of scholars and they write the definitive history of the previous dynasty. And so this is what, about 5 or 6 years ago, the present government in China has done just that. They are writing the definitive history of the Qing dynasty. And by doing that, they essentially acknowledge themselves as the next dynasty. So this is very, very typical. So this is what culture means, that it's very deep roots of ways that different countries converge on governing themselves. And
and this is different from the social psychology, as like social psychological aspect that you saw present in the U.S. and this kind of New Deal era. Is that right? So what is that?
Yeah, there's no sharp boundary, but social psychology that I'm talking about is a faster operating. It operates at the level of a human generation or so. So let's trace it, what happened in the United States. And also it helps us to understand how the wealth pumps get started. So
and also how potentially to get out of it, because one of the conflicts that we reach in thinking about these problems is, well, if it is deeply rooted in culture, how do you get those shifts?
Yes, exactly. So United States had experienced a really major civil war in the 1860s. And then there was another revolutionary situation around 1910s and 1920s. There was huge numbers of race riots. There was violent labor strikes, anarchist bombings, and also there was the presence of the Bolshevik Russia, which also frightened the elites. The first Red Scare was in 1921. And so the elites became very frightened. That was one of the moving forces. They were afraid of a Bolshevik revolution essentially happening within the United States. And that was a moving force that moved a segment of the more prosocial segment of the elites to try to solve the problems. They basically said the same thing that Alexander II, this Russian Tsar, told his nobility back in 1860, right, that we either have reform from above or revolution from below. And of course, I don't want to deny agency here. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his team, they were really thinking prosocially, and they were very good, and they were a key element in getting that the New Deal finally set in stone. And that shut down the wealth pump because it gave power to workers to organize and bargain. It introduced the minimum wage and kept rising it, by the way. And it imposed huge taxes on the wealthy. So even by 1960, the top rate was 90% on the rate of on the top incomes.
Well, side note, they did also establish as a result some of the systems that would then become the new wealth pump, in the sense that they created such concentration of industry, more regulation that allows for concentration, because more concentration allows for easier control from the federal government.
Right, but on the other hand, they prevented such concentration in the banking and financial sectors, and those barriers were dismantled during the 1980s, essentially.
Sorry, just to make sure I understand what you're saying. Then, you're deriving their desire to reform essentially themselves, the other members of the elite ruling class and ruling class, because of what they lived through in the 1920s. It was a psychological response to that instability, and therefore some sort of recognition that if they don't act, there could be collapse. Are you saying it was like self-conscious?
Yes, that's my explanation, because it's not just, we look at many dozens, actually almost 200 cases of past crises. So in the majority of them, the elites are overthrown, dispossessed, sometimes even exterminated. But in a small minority, they get frightened. And okay, maybe a better word to say that they adopt the long-term view. Okay.
Right. Okay. They get enlightened.
They understand that. Yeah, they understand their enlightened self-interest. So, in order to preserve the capitalist system in the United States, they had to do A, B, C, and D in order to put it back into balance. All right. So back to 1970s. At this point, most of the people everybody who was a part of the decision-making apparatus during the New Deal, they have retired or died. And a new generation of elites came that never experienced those things. And they, after the 30 glorious years, so this is 1945 to 1975, it's these 3 decades where they brought unprecedented, broadly based well-being to countries like the United States, France, and so on. So the elites became accustomed to it, and they essentially, it's very easy to think that now things will take care of themselves automatically. Things will continue to be good. Such periods of integrative phases, as we call them, that's when the elites typically become tempted to reconfigure the economy in their own favor. And that's what essentially happened. So the power of workers to organize and bargain was gradually taken away, especially during the 1980s. The minimum wage stopped increasing, so in real terms it was eroded. And of course, they removed most of in a series of steps, they removed the high taxes on the wealthy. So as a result of that, they restarted the wealth pump. And that's when I'm sure you've seen this graph, which shows how prior to late 1970s, the productivity of American workers grew quite well and wages were growing in parallel. But after 1970s, they departed. The productivity continued to increase, but the wages stagnated and even declined. And so all that extra productivity went where it went to the economic elites. Over the 40 years up to 20 teens from 1970s, the numbers of decamillionaires increased tenfold. Population grew 40%, but the number of decamillionaires increased tenfold. And that provided us with a pool of elite aspirants who wanted, to become president or senator or whatever. So that was one thing. The second thing is that because of the general immiseration, and this is real immiseration we are talking about, we have, thanks to 2 economists, Case and Deaton, we know about the deaths of despair, especially affecting the 60% of Americans, the working class. Those are the people who don't have a college degree. So the rates of suicide, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, they have increased. So to the point where we now, the overall life expectancy of Americans has been declining since 2017, even before COVID. All right, so we have overproduction of the wealthy people. We have immiseration and growing discontent amongst the general population. And third thing is that now people more ambitious and active people want to escape this immiseration, right? And that's why many of them, how do you do that? You acquire education. And so that's why you had a huge demand for education, especially for advanced degrees. And that also leads to elite overproduction. So all these 3 factors have been operating. And as we were talking about a few minutes ago, I don't see any signs that they have been, that these trends have stopped. Essentially, in order to stop all these trends, because the root cause is the wealth pump, the first thing we need to do is to stop the wealth pump, get the salaries of the median salaries back to grow together with GDP per capita. And that will eventually shut off the overproduction of both too overly wealthy and overly educated. Although that will take many years, and we have to somehow to survive through those years.
See, but here's the problem. Talking about shutting down the wealth pump is one thing, but then envisioning a policy that oversees that is completely different, because as we often talk about in this podcast, many of the policies that seem tailor-made to alleviate social inequalities end up either reproducing them intentionally or otherwise, or at least just shifting the inequality sideways and causing a different type of immiseration without really addressing the core causes to the extent that's possible. And I don't know, maybe the problem is that the elites on both right and left aren't really touching the things that need to be changed. So we are shifting power on matters that don't really affect the wealth pump. But I don't know, maybe we are just, it's not a matter of will as much as it is a matter of competence.
This almost suggests, Adam, that you don't think it's culture, or rather there's a culture of incompetence that gets in the way of a culture of values.
I mean, that's what I actually don't know. Is it a matter of we are not having the right conversations? We are not willing psychologically to touch the things that we want to. I guess that's the social psychology, the smaller scale changes that need to happen. Or I don't know. I genuinely don't know. By the way, just to recap the difference for you with social psychology, between social psychology and culture, is that social psychology is your tactical approach as a society within the constraints of a culture at a certain time.
All right. So maybe it is better to, I don't want to make this very hard distinction. So culture with very deep roots versus, let's call it culture that's happening on a much faster time scale.
I do like thinking in these terms, because you can say that even when you have the swing of politics in the United States throughout its 200 and almost 50 years of existence, it still exists within a framework of ideas and self-understanding that persists throughout history, and that's the culture. So the mood, I'm going to call it the mood, the social mood might shift, but it is still constrained within that culture, and the rights and wrongs of the mood still need to be somewhat explained within a stricture that precedes the current state of social psychology.
Yeah,
and that's culture.
So, for example, what will happen to the United States after we are, through these times of trouble? It's unlikely that we will have a general ruling the country, because it's not really in the cultural genes. All right. So hopefully it will be some kind of a democracy, hopefully better than the one we had before the crisis. But again, the historical record shows that typically the institutions before crisis are remodeled maybe and reshaped, but they are reused after crisis.
So let's get back to Adam's question about will versus competence.
Yeah, so to get to Adam's question, you put your finger on, maybe obliquely, on a very serious problem, the problem of unintended consequences. So how do we design policies and institutions that actually produce the desired outcome, which is increase in well-being, rather than undesirable outcomes? And here I argue that what we need a science of history. We need a science of our complex, large-scale societies that allows us to run proposed policies and reforms first as mathematical models, and then see whether any unintended consequences emerge. Because unaided human brain is really not capable of tracing all the intricate feedbacks, nonlinear feedbacks that characterize dynamical systems such as our society. And this is where we need a mathematical model. We are not there yet. I think our theory is good enough to yield quite a number of important insights, and I've been emphasizing one of them, that we've got to shut down the wealth pump. But then, and it's possible to do because the United States did it in the 1920s, 30s, right? And other countries did it at some other times. But the United States today is very different from the United States of the New Deal. So we cannot just, copy what they did then. We need to tailor whatever we do to our current conditions. And that essentially requires building a mathematical model of how society will respond to various nudges and policies and finding out ahead of time whether there is going to be any unintended effects.
Right.
But I think even if you have something like that, what's to say that people are going to follow it, right? Especially if you have a culture of disintegrating trust with institutions, disbelief in elites, right? What's to say that you would get like the political will to even follow the teachings or findings of some sort of mathematical model?
Well, it's not just mathematical model; it's also analysis of huge amounts of data. But this is. But
the problem is ultimately it's fun because your solution to the Hayekian complexity problem is, well, we just need to have better, bigger models through better, bigger, I guess, computers and algorithms. But ultimately,
no. We need to have not bigger but smarter models.
Smarter.
Yes, because a model will give you results, different results depending on what you put into it. We don't know all the ingredients that we need to put in the model. That requires further research and further testing of our theory in other empirical situations. So that's what needs to be done. We need to increase our understanding of how societies operate and evolve.
Yeah, but I keep getting stuck though on this idea of culture for the elites to believe in an enlightened sense of their own of reform over their self-interest. And I think even if they had access to incredibly intelligent information, you still have to create some sort of culture in which they say, yes, I will follow the lead of this information and I will pursue something against my own self-interest. Like that's for me the thing I'm getting tripped up on.
Well, so the way I see it is that it takes both the pro-social segments of the elites. And remember, not people are different. Some people are very rational and they only care about number one. But other people feel that they want the whole humanity, or at least the whole population of the United States, to get ahead. But also we need to put pressure on them from below. So I'm a scientist. I'm not going to start a social movement, but we need to start grassroots movements that would put pressure on our elites to do the right thing.
If we're talking about creating a movement with either giving culture a nudge or a shift of, as you put it, social psychology within a culture to a place that is more pro-social, how do you do this? Is this a question of you need a new guru? Is this a question of
a pro-social counter elite?
Pro-social counter
to lead the fold.
But how do you get that? How does it get a footing within a culture that is becoming increasingly recalcitrant, self-defensive, self-protective, and just selfish, I suppose, and it can convince them that this movement is truly pro-social, and to Vanessa's point, that will also be effective in a time where people are incredibly mistrustful? Is it ultimately a matter of charisma because the trust needs to come before this new idealized pro-social elite actually has a chance to make any difference? So trust has to come from somewhere, which I can't think of anything but a charismatic leader, which is not the best ideal to follow, right? Because the charismatic leader could lead you astray, or maybe if you're lucky, it could make the change that you want. But that's we were thinking about our conversation with Tom Holland and Tomer Persico regarding why Christianity was so revolutionary. It's because, according to them, it instilled the symbol of an elite disarming itself. It created the idea that self-sacrifice is the noblest virtue, is the closest you can be as a human to the divine.
Yeah, I agree.
But that ultimately comes back to a charismatic narrative, right? It's that story that was so powerful that made the difference. It's not that Christianity proved itself. I guess you can argue that it proved itself, quote unquote, to people by its spread. But the original reason that it spread wasn't because there was any empirical proof that it creates better, more thriving societies. But the idea spread because of its charismatic appeal. So that's ultimately what you need in order to see a pro-social resurgence, isn't it?
Here, I would like to disagree with you somewhat. So first of all, Christianity was only part of the actual age religions. Buddhism and a few other religions, they have also had a very significant pro-social effects on the elites by constraining them to be good and to do good. And secondly, it's what we call in cultural evolution, we call it the selection by consequences. Now, it turned out that societies that adopted those actual age creeds, they became more successful than others because one of the reasons is because their rulers behaved in more pro-social ways than rulers without such. Everything is relative here. All right.
Right, but the adoption had to precede that.
No, because other societies observe successful societies and start mimicking their. For example, I'll give you a good example: monogamy. All right. So monogamy. We now have good research that shows that monogamous societies are much more stable, and than polygamous societies. They have less crime. So there is a whole bunch of different outcomes that you can observe. And so this is what we saw, that for formerly polygamous societies like Turkey, for example, or Japan, they have adopted the law that only one man, one wife. And why did they do it? Because they were imitating successful societies. But anyway, we got a little bit sidetracked. So getting back on what can be done, I agree with you. I also have, I don't like necessarily relying on one individual. So, and I don't want to be a seer either, or prophet, or anything of that. And we know that that good outcomes are achieved by large numbers of people cooperating together. So cooperation is the key. And to do that, this is why I think that we need both the movements from below and also pro-social counter-elites. So not all counter-elites who want to challenge the existing order necessarily have to adopt violent means. So we need some pro-social counter-elites who will perhaps engineer a peaceful revolution.
I'll start recruiting my lawyer friends.
Yeah, well, lawyers are unfortunately not the best pro-social people. Economists are even worse, by the way. Anyway, there are actual studies that show that economists, when you play public goods games, they always defect, or 90% of them defect. Okay, what we need...
They take their own theory of rationality too seriously.
Yeah, so what we need a Ministry of Social Health, right? We have the Secretary of Health, all right? We have ecological organizations, right? Environmental Protection Agency. Now we need an agency that would be integrating research and data collection and ideas and different types of specialists in one place to propose and promote good policies and reforms. And I know I'm sitting here in the United States. And in the United States, the majority of people think that the government is the source of evil. And here I am proposing another government agency.
Right. I was thinking to myself, I am not the most libertarian specimen. But hearing the words Ministry of Social Health does give me chills.
I know. We certainly don't want a Ministry of Truth. That's for sure.
No. Yeah.
Well, so I'm proposing this with a little tongue in cheek,
I understand. You were also joking last time, or half joking, and you mentioned it earlier about having this centralized authority for observing those checkmark points in the future to ensure that we are on path for stability. I remember we mangled it into something like the Federal Reserve for cloud dynamics or historical foresight and social stability. But again, to Vanessa's point, and I think this is where the tension is, especially given, as you pointed out yourself, with American culture, is an implementation. Even if we see that you have solved the Hayekian problem and we can be at a point where we have enough information and smart enough models in order to project accurately the risks and expect the unexpected consequences, it's still a long way to go to sell that in a way that doesn't in itself creates a violent reaction and public mistrust, but also B, create a whole new institution that is just waiting to be abused and re-implemented in an unintended way. Create an entire system that is just, well, we are now the new authority on what's good for society. And all it takes is 3 generations of administrators being replaced, where you start doubting whether or not the fundamental interests of the institution are truly presered.
And there is a number of pitfalls. I agree with you completely.
Yes,
so realistically, my hopeful expectation is that because this these end times come roughly every couple 100 years or so, right? I think that we'll be ready for the next one, all right? But we'll have to lay the foundations now. And exactly what form it will take, it is very difficult to say. But the very first thing that we need to understand what are the deep roots of our problems of today. It's not Joe Biden or Trump or these or that individuals. No, the deep roots are the structural trends that have been developing over the past 50 years. System, it will take quite a big effort to reverse it, because that's what we see in positive outcomes. It takes often several decades to get things accomplished, and so that's what. It's probably too late for this crisis for us, all right? but hopefully you'll learn. But we hopefully learn.
Right. And I do think
Right.
that's why we love talking to you, because one of our many mottos is everything is broken, and you take this point seriously. You are not just throwing it at topic du jour and shows this is the apotheosis of the corruption on the left or the corruption on the right. You are trying to understand as you said, the inertial problems underlying it, and why it's not just a matter of we woke up one day to an experience of a worse world, but things have been set in place and in motion that may have started well and are now, by their own inertia, moving either off the rails or into the, in the direction that they were always intended for, but we couldn't have foreseen. So my last question before we go in, to the extent that the question will even make sense, but do you see your project more akin to Hari Seldon or Leto II?
Neither. Okay, Leto II, just one God Emperor, that's definitely not the way to.
No, that's what I said. Not him himself, not you as a person, but the project. Do you see the project of creating a model projected to the future and then trying to steer America and maybe the world, and we didn't actually get to talk about the world, but the world on a better path? Do you see, and take it as you will, I'll add my own afterthoughts on this extra nerdy question later on, but I do wonder if you see yourself more in the Seldon-y approach or
No,
the
neither. So both of those are fictional characters. And in real life, progress is accomplished by cooperation of many people, not a single individual. All right. And so what we need is to get organized and both advance our science and then learn how to use the science to make our societies work better. After all, when you build a bridge, you don't just sit there and imagine how to do it. You call an engineer and architect and so on and so forth. So we need to do the same thing to fix our societies.
I will. I have to go, but I'll one day try to catch you to expand why I do think you're more Selden than Leto. But we'll to be continued.
Yeah, every time we talk with you, Peter, we always want to talk about so much more. So, but thank you for your time, and maybe we'll do it again. We'll just keep the conversation going.
I enjoyed the conversation very much.
Thank you, Peter.
This was awesome. Thank you, and yes, hopefully we'll do it again.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcast. If you like us and want us to keep doing this, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or just share us with your friends and enemies. Until next time, stay sane.